Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us in this panel. We have a couple of speakers today. Benjamin Varlese. Benjamin has been a student of American Military University since 2014, and he's in his second year of the Doctorate on Global Security program. He's a former U.S. Army Light Infantry Platoon Sergeant. He served in domestic and overseas roles from 2001 to 2018, including from 2003 to 2005 as a sniper section leader. Besides his military service, Mr. Varlese worked on the U.S. Ambassador to Iraq's Protective Security Detail in various roles and currently manages a security detachment for the Denver City and County government buildings and the Denver Health Medical Complex. Since 2018, he has also provided security consulting services for public and private sectors to include tactical training, physical and information security, executive protection, protective intelligence, risk management, inside threat mitigation, and anti-terrorism. Then we have Mr. Matthew Timmerman. He's an adjunct professor and a doctoral candidate at American University. His research examines triggers of interstate conflict. His work is in the subdiscipline of security studies and focuses primarily on the political factors that cause governments to militarily intervene in the civil wars of other states. Matthew's other areas of interest include foreign policy, decision-making, and national security strategy. I will stop there and pass the floor to Mr. Matthew Timmerman.
Thank you, Mr. Gutierrez Sandoval. I'm going to screen share and hopefully this reaches everyone. Is that being broadcast properly?
Yes,
Great.
yes.
Great, okay. Gonna try to make it. All right, there we go. And I'll minimize this. Okay, thank you. Thank you for having me today. It's a pleasure to be a part of this, and I was looking through the talks earlier in the abstracts, and this is just a very exciting event where there's so many different approaches to peace and conflict studies and addressing different issues and making the world a better place. And so I'm very excited to be here today and to have the chance to speak. It's really an honor. I'm going to be talking today about the link between political threats and military intervention. And my primary case that I'll be discussing is Saudi Arabia and their current intervention in Yemen, informed by their intervention in North Yemen in the past. And I look forward to getting questions and feedback, and just very excited to be a part of this. So let's talk for a second about what we define an intervention as. I just give a very simple, straightforward definition for military intervention. And in the context of what I'm doing, I define military intervention as using force to affect the internal political situation of a target nation. So this means that you're mobilizing your national military resources to shape events inside another country, political events inside another country, for different motivations, which I'll get to in a second. So I equate military intervention with political interference in the target state. Now, sort of building on some pre-existing typologies for what intervention is and its relationship to politics, I break it down into two important concepts. One would be, if you're seeking to transform the politics of a target nation, you either want to stabilize those politics or you want to destabilize those politics. So when you intervene to back the status quo inside the target state, I would call that a stabilization mission. And when you intervene to back the anti-status quo actor that's seeking to tear down the pre-crisis political status quo, I would define that as a destabilization intervention. And then we have a whole other subcategory of non-transformative interventions that might not meet the definition that I'm looking at. But to put it into more simple terms, I think we're all familiar with the ongoing war in Syria. In this crisis, I would describe Russia and Iran as stabilizers in terms of they're engaged in stabilization interventions, in that they're seeking to keep the pre-Arab Spring government in power, whereas some of the other surrounding Arab states that have been involved in backing the Syrian opposition would be intervening in a destabilization context, seeking to overturn the pre-Arab Arab Spring status quo in Syria. What are some of the motivations for intervening? I think the best data set that's out there in terms of describing these motivations comes from Kissinjani and Pickering, who are affiliated with Kansas State, and their data set outlines about 10 different motives that can drive intervention. And you can see that list on the left there, and on the left-hand column. It can relate to humanitarian interests, economic interests, territorial interests, diplomatic property preservation. So all sorts of different reasons you might send your military force into another country. But what we do see is that this broad catch-all category of strategic interest is a very common driver affiliated with intervention. Countries very often intervene in other contexts for strategic reasons. But I'm going to argue today that perhaps we've put a little too much emphasis on that strategic motivation, and domestic politics, or an intervener's interests in domestic politics of the target nation, also represents a very critical motivation that we have perhaps not put enough emphasis on. So as you can see on this table, about 5 down, you will see affect the domestic dispute. So very often interveners are interested in the domestic political disputes of the target country and shaping those disputes for different reasons, which I'll get to in a second. So I put here the chessboard picture because we typically think of the chessboard as an analogy for strategy. The strategic interest motivation for intervention says that the intervener is interested in shaping the target state's politics because doing so expands its sphere of influence relative to rivals, and can expand its can enhance the regional balance of power in its favor relative to rivals. If you're able to dictate political outcomes in the target in the way that you see fit, you can, in doing so, create sister states or allies that then serve you and your geostrategic interests in the region. And as I said before, this is a great explanation for intervention. It's helped us to explain a lot of interventions, such as the Cold War interventions, whether it's the US and its interests in Vietnam, or the Soviet Union and its interests in Angola or other contexts, Afghanistan. There's a lot of value to this explanation for intervention. But I'd like to argue that there's also value to thinking about the political interests of interveners. And the political interest explanation of intervention says that governments may seek to use military force to shape a target state's politics because they fear how that target state's politics will affect their own political survival prospects at home. This dovetails with the notion that political change is contagious. When uprisings happen in one state, they can spread to another. Hence, I've used the Newton's cradle analogy here to capture this idea that political change carries momentum, crosses borders, spreads from one country to another. And leaders, fearful of how this political change might envelop them, seek to preempt this change by stabilizing countries around them before those governments fall from power, as a way of securing themselves. So it's a preemptive approach to maintaining one's power at home, influencing other countries first. And so I also will argue here that it's a competing and alternative explanation for intervention, different from the strategic explanation that I just explained earlier. These are conceptually very distinct motivations for intervening, though we may see both at play for the same cases. So I put this on a table here, juxtaposing the strategic threat explanation of intervention versus the political threat explanation. And I give some examples there at the bottom. Obviously, Vietnam is one that is typically thought of as a strategic intervention, but there's other examples as well. On the right-hand side of the column, I look at, say, the Soviet Union's interventions into Hungary during the 1950s. Of course, Moscow was fearful of how Hungary's uprising could generate political instability in the Soviet orbit and uproot its power. So as mentioned, I think these two explanations for intervention are applicable to the same cases, and you can see both logics at play simultaneously. So I've listed some just international cases that I've been looking at in terms of trying to test these two explanations of intervention against each other. For example, with the Uzbekistan case, Uzbekistan intervened in Tajikistan in the 1990s. Certainly there were strategic reasons for that, but Uzbekistan's post-Soviet communist government was also very fearful of how the Tajikistani opposition could jeopardize its own authority. So I do think that this explanation, this political threat explanation for intervention, goes beyond the Middle East, though I know that's the focus for today's conference. Now I'm going to proceed to focus a bit on Saudi Arabia and talk first about their intervention into North Yemen and how it related to political interests, and how we can use our understanding of this history to understand what's motivating Saudi Arabia's intervention into Yemen today. So when you're testing these rival explanations against each other, you have to clarify, what is evidence in favor of what I'm arguing versus what is evidence in favor of this competing alternative. So as I've been going through the Saudi Arabian case, in order to support my hypothesis, the evidence I've been looking for is that the Saudi Arabian government had, going back to the 1960s in their intervention in North Yemen, I've been looking for historical evidence that would suggest that they saw events in North Yemen as potentially contagious to their own authority at home. So realizing now I should give some background on this case. In the 1960s, the North Yemen was a monarchy. It was overthrown by a military nationalist cohort of Yemeni free officers, and it created a civil war. The monarchy was deposed, but was not eliminated. They were on the ropes and initiated a counter-revolution against the Yemeni free officers, and North Yemen was enveloped in civil war from 1962 to 1967. And Saudi Arabia intervened to support the monarchists, the royalists, and Egypt intervened very massively with 70,000 troops to support the Yemeni free officers. And it was one of the region's main crises before the Arab-Israeli wars. My interest here is what motivated Saudi Arabia's intervention into North Yemen. And the goal I've been trying to show is that political threat logic was a driver of this intervention. So the evidence I've been looking for is evidence in favor of the notion that Saudi Arabian elites in Riyadh felt that Yemen's internal politics would threaten their own politics, and that the counter evidence I've been assessing is evidence that Saudi Arabia had strategic interests relative to North Yemen vis-a-vis Egypt at the time. Of course, Egypt and Saudi Arabia were rivals, competing rivals in the Middle East during this period. And I do think both logics are at play for this case. But broadly, as I have assessed the evidence, I have found convincing evidence that political threat logic did very much underpin Saudi Arabia's intervention into North Yemen during this historical episode. So what type of evidence can we find to show this? Some of it is inference. It's not necessarily direct evidence, but you can infer it from what you gather. So there was increased domestic repression against nationalists inside Saudi Arabia as this intervention was unfolding. We can presume from that evidence that the Saudi Arabian government was fearful of the spread of nationalism from North Yemen to Saudi Arabia. We know that Crown Prince Faisal ousted King Saud during the war, and he used one of his biggest critiques against Saud was that Saud was weak on the nationalist threat. Saud was dismissive of the severity of this threat and dismissive of how North Yemen amplified this threat. Riyadh during this period under Crown Prince Faisal spearhead a monarchical alliance among Jordan and Iran, a monarchy at the time, in relation to North Yemen. When you feel as though your political regime type is threatened by events in another country, you tend to band together with other governments that practice the same political model as you. So this would be monarchies teaming up. We know from diplomatic cables that Riyadh was very intent during this period on blocking international recognition of the nationalist Free Yemeni officers in Sana'a, the goal being to discredit them. And we know that Riyadh was very insistent on during this period on pushing this ideological message that monarchy was organic, that it was natural, that it had grassroots support in the Arabian Peninsula, that the Yemeni people wanted to have a monarchy, and that the nationalist free officers were imposing an alien regime type on the country. We also see some very fascinating divergences during this period between Saudi Arabia and the United States. The United States felt very firmly that in response to what was happening in North Yemen, that Saudi Arabia needed to reform internally, that the political threat that the Saudis were facing was because they were practicing a backward and anachronistic regime type. The Saudis felt quite the opposite. They felt that their regime type was fine, and they instead pushed for the US to join them in combating the Egyptian nationalist threat from North Yemen. So whereas the United States felt like securing Saudi Arabia was an inside-out tactic that would involve internal reform inside the kingdom, the Saudi Arabians felt very differently. They had an outside-in interpretation and felt like they needed to effect change in Yemen, restore monarchy in Yemen in order to protect themselves at home. So it's a really interesting juxtaposition that emerges between the US and Saudi Arabia about how Saudi Arabia is being affected by North Yemen. And this led them to think about different tactics. So the US prioritized constitutional monarchy, economic development inside Saudi Arabia, whereas the Saudis were instead focused on, hey, let's block these radio attacks on monarchy. Let's stop the Yemeni free officers from being recognized internationally, etc. Different approaches to securing Saudi Arabia with this chaos or this crisis across the border. Taking that history of Saudi Arabia and North Yemen during the 60s, I think we have some really fascinating insights into Saudi Arabia's intervention in Yemen today, which we all know about Yemen being the worst humanitarian crisis in the world right now. A very interesting parallel is that, of course, Saudi Arabia's primary regional rival is also now affiliated with events in Yemen. Iran is seen as a backer of the Houthis. And I argue that while it's true, there is an Iran-Houthi connection, perhaps the notion that Iran is trying to use Yemen as a strategic foothold or a launching pad for aggression in the region has been overstated. When we dig into the evidence, there's minimal evidence that Iran is planning to use Yemen as a base for its own forces to expand in the region. Though we hear this argument of Iranian expansionism being a threat and Yemen being an example of Iranian expansionism, I think tangible evidence suggests that maybe that threat has been overstated. And if that threat is overstated, let's think about some alternative reasons that Saudi Arabia might be threatened by events in Yemen. And that's what my project seeks to do. It doesn't seek to say that there's no link between the Iranians and the Houthis, but it does seek to say that there could be an alternative reason for why Saudi Arabia is interested in Yemen's ongoing civil war. So I focus on two reasons. The first is the way it relates to Saudi Arabia's domestic politics. Mohammed bin Salman, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, became defense minister just a few months before the intervention in early 2015. And up until today, we see strong evidence in the news that this war is integral to his domestic political standing. So I just recently found a headline in Al Riyadh Arabic that says, as air defenses save the nation, the Saudi people declare, we are all Mohammed bin Salman. So you see this rally around the flag effect of the Yemen intervention inside Saudi Arabia. This war has increased Saudi Arabia's profile, Mohammed bin Salman's profile inside Saudi Arabia. It's obviously a humanitarian disaster, but there's also a way you can assess the way that it is connected to domestic politics. The second factor I focus on is how the rise of the Houthis in Yemen has increased antagonism and suspicion of the Saudi Shia community, mostly in the eastern province. The notion that these Shia are a subversive minority that threatens the monarchy in Riyadh has increased as the Houthis have gained power in Yemen. Why is this? I think part of this has to do with the notion that the Houthis seizing control in Yemen creates conditions for the spread of transnational Shia politics in the region. And the Saudi monarchy has become more sensitive to its Shia minority and political contestation from the Shia minority as the Houthis have come to power and as the Houthis have been linked to Iran. Human Rights Watch has documented this at length in terms of the domestic repression on Saudi Shia, which overlaps with the Houthis' rise in Yemen. And a classic example that I look at in my research is the tension that surrounded the killing of Nimr al-Nimr, a Saudi Shia cleric. The Houthis condemned it, Iran condemned it, Iran called for an uprising in relation to Nimr's death. So Saudi Arabia is very threatened by how it perceives the Houthis and Iran as trying to subvert its domestic affairs. And that's what I argue in my project. So to wrap things up, there are competing explanations for intervention, the political and the strategic, and they may apply to the same case. And while we have conventionally looked at strategic logic as the dominant explanation for intervention and gained a lot from that, I argue that there are interventions today and in history where the political survival explanation provides us alternative important insights that we might otherwise gloss over. And I encourage continuing to develop this understanding of intervention and think about how it applies to other cases in the Middle East beyond Yemen, and how well it can be carried to other regions of the world as well.
Thank you, Matthew. And now we will pass the floor to Mr. Benjamin Varlese.
Good afternoon, everyone. So my project here is continuing with the theme of military intervention and its necessity, specifically focusing on Libya and some of the kind of after effects or unintended consequences related to getting militarily involved in Libya, specifically focusing on a recreation of the Libyan terror state. I got interested in this subject quite a few years ago. I had a personal stake in some of the events that transpired after the fall of Gaddafi. So it kind of aligned with a lot of my research interests and on extremism, as well as, you know, the personal note there. And so I wanted to delve deep into why this happened, and what we can do in the future to prevent future issues that are ongoing in Libya. The U.S. has not been very good at regime change, probably at least in the last 20 years, but especially with what's going on, what's been going on recently. So what I did to focus on the Libya project was kind of break it down into three parts, looking at what Libya was like with regards to terrorism or violent extremism pre 9/11, or even pre Arab Spring, then looking at the Arab Spring uprisings and kind of the transition period there, and then a post-Gaddafi Libya. And then kind of based on those analysis, or the analysis of those three cases, kind of try and formulate opinions or policy recommendations for the future, so we can try and avoid creating another destabilized region that gives a safe haven to terrorism. I decided to forgo slides, so I'll go ahead and just get started here. So we're looking at, pre-Arab Spring, pre 9/11. Gaddafi was one of the foremost, and Libya was one of the foremost state sponsors of terrorism. He allowed for terror camps to be set up within his borders, provided material aid regularly to various terrorist groups, the Palestinian, PFLP, the PLO, and even some other non-Muslim, non-Palestinian terror groups, such as the IRA, Irish Republican Army, and the Red Army faction. Gaddafi, in fact, took it one step further and actually started to use his intelligence and security services to conduct acts of terror himself, as part of his foreign policy there. So examples of this was his sponsorship of the Lockerbie bombing, and then in 1985, there was a, sorry, I missed the date here, but there was Libyan intelligence was linked to a bombing in Berlin that killed several U.S. soldiers. To kind of detract and deter future engagement in this, President Reagan enacted Operation El Dorado Canyon, which was a retaliatory strike. It was aimed directly at Gaddafi. It missed, but it gave the message, and so state sponsorship and active role in terrorism kind of waned a bit. Now we jump forward to it was actually after 9/11. It was after the U.S. invasion of Iraq, where Gaddafi kind of had an aha moment and decided that the U.S. was serious, and if he wanted to remain in power and not be deposed with the help of the U.S., he needed to do a significant 180. He did probably about a 135. He had shut down his bioweapons and other WMD programs, actually started to kick out and shut down these terror camps that he had let kind of go on within his borders for many, many years. And we look at some of the literature around that, where it was authors like Gentleson and Whitlock kind of showed this transformation and how Gaddafi saw it in his best interests to not align himself with terrorism anymore. One of the big reasons for this also was he was starting to have his own internal strife within his borders, or it was becoming inflamed due to more radicalized Islamic sects that commonly aligned with groups like Al Qaeda, and to kind of forgo that, used his own methods, enemy of my enemy is my friend kind of deal, when it came to a partnership with the U.S. and a lot of the other Western allies. So then, fast forwarding now to late 2010, Tunisia kind of kicks off the Arab Spring uprisings, and Gaddafi finds himself in a little bit of a spot, because there was always this strong contrast between Eastern and Western Libya, and Eastern Libya was much more put under the thumb by Gaddafi throughout, and saw this new opportunity to kind of rebel, break away from Tripoli and Gaddafi's regime. You also started to see a rise in more of these Islamic militias that wanted to assert themselves. They saw the rise of Daesh, or ISIS, in Syria and Iraq, and kind of their progression, and using the chaos to insert themselves more fully. ISIS also started to send out kind of emissaries, if you will, to kind of, I guess, insert or develop their own kind of hegemony there in North Africa. So now you have these militias that are have been infiltrated by radicals, and the message is more than just, okay, hey, we're overthrowing a despotic regime. It's now, hey, we want to create another Salafist state. The point at which the US and NATO got involved, the French and British were the first to kind of have some alarm bells and decide, hey, we need to do something. And they were looking at it more as a mass atrocity response operation. The jus in bello, or justification for, or excuse me, jus ad bellum, justification for war, as the responsibility to protect. There was very little on the ground interaction. There were some small special operations forces and intelligence and military advisors on the ground working with these militias, as is pretty common. Most of the interventions were in the form of military air support, give the militias a fighting chance. We also did, the US also engaged in a lot of material support, similar to we have with other revolutionary or resistance movements, like support of the Free Syrian Army in Syria, um, the Kurds in Iraq, and kind of, again, putting these militias on even ground. Unfortunately, there wasn't a whole lot of vetting going on. It was just, hey, you guys are trying to overthrow Gaddafi. We're trying to prevent a humanitarian crisis or something that's worse, and then kind of worrying about the after effects later. There was some consternation within the Obama administration as to the level of support. Then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton she was on the fence, but she was leaning more towards deposing Gaddafi. Then Secretary of Defense Robert Gates, he saw it as a bad idea, kind of, hey, let's make sure that nothing is going, we're not supporting Gaddafi, we're not also making the situation worse without a plan. So there was some battles there, and Obama was quoted as saying, it was 51-49 for and against. So then now Gaddafi's overthrown. There's an interim government gets installed, but it's very chaotic. And again, there's a very sharp split between East and West. There are longstanding rivalries that dated back centuries between Benghazi and Tripoli, made forming a unity government very difficult. Militias were everywhere, and it basically broke down into a very tribalist conflict. And there was some relative peace at first, where everybody was celebrating Gaddafi being down, but as the government was being formed, those things kind of fell apart. Now, here is where the U.S. kind of dropped the ball. Instead of maintaining a military presence or expanding a military presence to kind of assist with stability operations, building up foreign internal defense, getting all these militias to kind of work together, much like the early days in Afghanistan, where getting the Northern Alliance all to work together. That didn't really happen here. It kind of migrated into a hands-off approach, which really gave these more radical militias and extremist groups a chance to really entrench themselves into what had happened. Now, at this point, it's essentially a free-for-all here in Libya. The U.S. is focusing on diplomatic efforts, but is doing nothing to, again, get these militias to work together. It's kind of, well, I'm going to work with these guys a little bit over here. I'm going to work with these guys a little bit over here. But it wasn't, okay, hey, all you militias need to come in together under, the new General National Army. Apologize here. Notes got stuck. At any rate, one of the main kind of one of the main militias that we hear that kind of broke away and started to cause Libya to descend more into chaos and give Ansar al-Sunnah, Al-Qaeda in Islamic Maghreb, and the Libyan Islamic group more sway was the 17 February militia. Now we had started working with them in the Benghazi area, but we didn't fully vet them to kind of weed out some of the more extremist views to see if they were going to work with the international community and the new Libyan government to kind of build it up. As a result, again, you have the east versus west split, and things really start descending into chaos. ISIS moves in and it becomes fully entrenched, slowly but surely, with more U.S. and allied state interventions and the fall of the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq. The Libyan sect kind of starts losing its power, and influence gets driven down south. Now, the southern regions were very tribal. It's very similar to Waziristan along the Afghan-Pakistan border, and again becomes a new safe haven where they can launch attacks and provide other support in the surrounding areas such as Mali, Chad, and as far down as Niger. Now, as far as recommendations go, the military intervention in Libya was essentially, we have a responsibility to protect. But once the threat had subsided, or the initial threat by Gaddafi was gone, there was no plan to stabilize it. In Afghanistan, we had an interim government almost immediately. We already had somebody picked up that was, we believed, was going to unify and prop up the new Afghan government. In Iraq, there was a lot of the same, where we were bringing in former dissidents to kind of rebuild their government. De-Baathification was its own issue, and could have prevented some of the problems in Iraq. But again, this goes to how much, once we get involved, once there is that military intervention, how much should we stay involved? To what extent? What is the military and diplomatic balance? In Libya, we didn't see any military diplomatic balance. It transitioned straight from air support and arming these militias straight into, okay, we're going to set up temporary mission facilities and an embassy and go right into diplomacy, working with these new groups without, again, finding a way to unify all these different sects that have been fighting for several centuries. Some of the Benghazi, Tripoli kind of rivalries have been going back to almost the 7th century. So recommendations in the future, if the U.S. is going to get into another military intervention, it's find a suitable replacement for the regime that we are ousting. Ensure that we have popular support for that, and find ways to maintain that popular support, and kind of develop a security structure through foreign internal defense, law enforcement, um, infrastructure, humanitarian needs, and kind of build off of all these aspects instead of just focusing entirely, okay, we're going to transition like a light switch military to uh, uh, diplomatic. So I'm about out of time. Mr. Gutierrez, I'm ready for our Q&A session. Thank you for the opportunity, everybody.
Thank you very much, Benjamin, and thank you, Matthew, for your presentations. Here is a question, and I guess it's for both of you. Is there a way to reconcile the apparent legitimate reasons for intervention in both Yemen and Libya by Saudi Arabia and the US, respectively, with the resulting humanitarian crisis that such interventions produce? Wouldn't you say that actually military intervention increases chaos and political threat? Whoever wants to go first.
Matthew, I'll let you take that first.
Could you repeat the beginning of that? I didn't hear the first sentence.
Is there a way to reconcile, on the one hand, the apparently legitimate reasons for intervention, both in Yemen and Libya, with the resulting humanitarian crisis that arise out of such interventions? Wouldn't you say that actually military intervention increases the potential for chaos and political threat?
Yeah, okay. Sure. So for the case of Yemen today, no, I don't think there's a way to reconcile the humanitarian dimension. It's a tragedy, and there's nothing that can excuse what's going on in Yemen in terms of the suffering. And the paradox is that Saudi Arabia is leading the coalition that's bombing Yemen, creating this crisis, but also is one of the biggest or the biggest country donor to the Yemen Relief Fund led by the UN. So it is very much a paradoxical situation, but I don't think anything can reconcile or can justify the humanitarian suffering in Yemen. I think, though, from the Saudi perspective, I would say I think they recognize now that the Houthis have a pretty firm control over Sana'a and much of the urban. They control the three most populous cities, and have pretty firm grasp on the western region of the country. I don't think Riyadh right now thinks that that they're going to reinstate Hadi's government the way that Hadi was in power post-Arab uprising. But they may feel as though contesting the Houthis in Yemen is itself an end worth trying to achieve. Rather than giving up on the cause, they might see this as anything to bog the Houthis down and to prevent them from consolidating authority in the country would be seen as something worth trying to do, sadly, because there's going to be humanitarian implications for that. And it is very much just a tough situation. And I think the Emirati withdrawal of its ground forces is also changing the Saudi calculus. The Yemen Data Project, which you can all publicly access, has data on airstrikes. I can't vouch for its factuality, but I know that many people cite it, and it would seem that the airstrikes are still continuing during COVID and during this period. And so I don't see, along with the Houthi cross-border drone strikes and ballistic missile strikes, I don't see the Saudis pulling out of Yemen in the immediate term future, unfortunately, because it is very sad what's happening.
Thank you. Before we move to Matthew, to Benjamin. Matthew, would you say that the military intervention was successful in some degree for Saudi Arabia?
Well, the Houthis are stronger now than they were in 2015, I would argue. So it hasn't achieved its objectives. I would not say it's been successful. No, I would not say that. But again, the Saudi goalposts may have shifted towards Yemen. Maybe in 2015, they thought that they had a real shot at reinstating Hadi's government, and now they've recognized that's not likely, but they'll still pursue new objectives.
Thank you. Benjamin, what's your point of view about the apparent legitimate reasons for military intervention in Libya, but the resulting humanitarian crisis? Do you think the intervention helped the Libyans and improved the American security situation in the Middle East?
So this one's difficult. I prescribe to the realist IR theory, and very much a pragmatist, where again, how much we have to now weigh the responsibility to protect initially, and what kind of humanitarian crisis was going on then versus what's transpired since 2011. And really, I mean, anytime you remove a significant power structure, I mean, Gaddafi had been in power since 1969. I mean, he was a constant. He was also a very progressive force in the Middle East in a lot of ways. I mean, yes, he was a despotic dictator, but like I was saying earlier, he was a counterterrorism ally. He, at a time when we really needed it, and by removing that power structure, it gave an opportunity for a lot of these groups to strive and thrive. And in that chaos, we also actually created a bigger humanitarian crisis with the migrant surge. And then, as with any conflict zone, you see an uptick in transnational organized crime, human trafficking, human smuggling, black market arms sales. I mean, even some narco trafficking started to get involved in Libya, just because there was no the fractured foreign internal defense forces there. Just really, there was nobody to stop these people. There's nobody to kind of keep things in check. So I am generally opposed to this kind of military intervention. Something along the lines of peacekeeping, like we saw in the Balkans, is traditionally more effective than picking sides. You start picking a side, it, and not have a neutral presence on the ground. Chaos ensues, and so I'm to answer your question. Long story short, I can't justify even humanitarian crisis like this.
Thank you. And since you mentioned realism in international relations theory, there seems to be a gap between realpolitik and America's idealism in the world since America entered the Second World War. Do you think those can be reconciled? Do you think American leaders could use more of realism international relations theory as opposed to relying solely on American idealism?
So I would say yes. I also look at it through the lens of globalist versus nationalism, regardless of the level of international cooperation, every country still is looking out for its best interests. And I think, in the Libyan kind of situation, it was it was our responsibility to protect. We have a moral obligation, because we can, to influence this region and look like the good guys. So from a realist perspective, um, again, saying, was this intervention worth it? Um, we would have liked for there to be a smooth transition, remove this despotic power, and new democracy form in the MENA, in the Middle East and North Africa. Um, Unfortunately, that didn't happen. Um, the realism was opportunists took over. They started fighting amongst themselves. Other non-state actors and hostile actors moved in again to exploit the chaos for money or ideological gains. Um, so yeah, from a realist perspective, military intervention just doesn't, more often than not, does not coincide. It doesn't have the same uh, uh, weight or necessity as it did during World War II um, in modern context.
So both of you seem to agree that the interventions in Libya and Saudi Arabia were really not successful, but perhaps we could say a failure, even though both for Yemen and Libya there seem to have been legitimate concerns of political threat. In the case of the United States, this is of course nothing new. The United States has been unfortunately invading countries without really paying attention to what's going to happen next. In the case of Saudi Arabia, it may have been an impossible calculation, of course, to know how the conflict was going to develop. What do you think about in terms of just in general military intervention? Do you think probably there's a need for certain guidelines or perhaps an agreement, or maybe we simply just need more study about how this works, or perhaps we are talking really about calculations always being impossible, and so you never know whether an intervention will be successful or not? What are your thoughts on that?
Mr. Timmerman, I'll let you go first.
So yeah, in terms of a framework, I think I would say that one big difference between my project and Mr. Varlese's project is he's looking at a superpower intervention in a failed state or a broken state caught up in an uprising and then later a civil war. And the calculus there might differ than the calculus for Saudi Arabia towards Yemen. The US calculus towards Libya might be a different logic than the Saudi calculus towards Yemen. And that's, I see a question in the chat related to this question: what extent does political threat motivation affect US policy? And I think these questions go together. I think US policy, the calculus, my political threat explanation of intervention that I am working on, among other people, is not perhaps the best explanation for US interventions in terms of what's happening. I think it's much more applicable to autocracies, and it's much more applicable to regional interventions rather than, say, Russian or US interventions. Great power interventions, if you want to call them that. I think the logic for those countries is different, and in that sense, I think I have to be careful in how in arguing in trying to argue too much for what I am saying, because I think while what I'm arguing can explain a case like Saudi Arabia and Yemen, or maybe even Iran and Syria, it might not be as applicable for what Mr. Varlese is looking at in terms of U.S. logic towards Gaddafi. I think there's something different happening there.
I'm actually glad you brought that up, Mr. Timmerman, because it does go to something else that I found in my research. It's not just where Saudi Arabia, the Saudi Arabia Yemeni intervention was more, seems more of a hegemony kind of conflict there. You know, Yemen's right on Saudi Arabia's doorstep. Iran, its involvement might be just to agitate their rivals, the Saudis, and not necessarily a power grab. Whereas in Libya now, we're seeing other world powers starting to get involved. The Russian private military company, Wagner Group, has a heavy presence in Libya. Turkish military and security companies and military advisors are operating in Libya. You know, Turkey's reasons may be hegemonic also, but Russia, it's definitely a thumbing their nose at the U.S. and saying, "Hey, you created this mess. We're going to take advantage of it." They're doing the same thing in Syria, and so I think, you know, to kind of look at, excuse me, you know, why the U.S. would get involved. Again, I think goes to kind of an altruistic thinking. Part of developing that calculus is also figuring out, okay, at what point does our military intervention move from altruistic and benign to just blind and making things worse. You know, a lot of the recent, well, even a lot of the past military interventions by the U.S. Have not taken into account a lot of kind of the histories and cultures and subnational identities within the countries that we are intervening in. You know, we understood the Shia Sunni split, but not really. We didn't understand kind of the tribal roots and how insecurity in the region would by culture, they would devolve to the lowest level of security that they had, which is, you know, the tribal units. And some of these tribal units, you know, they had rivalries that made the Hatfields and McCoys, you know, look like a kiddie fight at Chuck E. Cheese, to be a little informal. And we see the same thing in Libya, where, you know, these century-old rivalries between, you know, Benghazi, the east, and Tripoli in the west, and how it really just did not. They didn't factor it in. They didn't talk to enough or the right subject matter experts before getting involved, and it was kind of a hasty response. Like I said, French and British got involved first, and I think that kind of helped push some of that. You know, I could see why the French would get involved in Libya based on their history in North Africa, the British too, to some degree. The US, I think, they saw an opportunity. They said, hey, we have international support, and just kind of moved in.
Thank you. I don't think we have any more questions. So I think, yes, Matthew.
Well, I wanted to ask Mr. Varlese what he thinks about Haftar's government in terms of its sort of attempt to gain more credibility internationally and position itself as the counterterrorism faction inside Libya, but still not being supported by, as I understand it, Italy is not supporting it, and along with other countries as well. So could you speak a little bit about that faction, the Haftar faction, and
right. So
yeah.
As far as the Haftar faction and, you know, Italy's lack of support, Italy of the Western states has probably been the most impacted by the Libyan civil war because of the mass number of uh, migrants flooding out of that country. And it's not just from Libya. It's throughout North Africa, and even some of the Sahel is moving through Libya towards Italy. And their concerns are, hey, you need to stop this. You need to get a handle on this before we can get involved, as a kind of a show of good faith. Now, their counterterrorism efforts have gone a long way in reducing the ISIS or mitigating some of the ISIS presence, pushing them farther south. Although it's creating problems elsewhere, it's not necessarily fixing the problem. It's a band-aid. It is a good step forward. I think if they want to gain more legitimacy, working towards and kind of seeking to unify and come to the table, I think would again go a long way.
Thank you. Michelle Watts asks Ben, do you think altruism is the primary motivation in the interventions you mentioned? You have spoken about that.
Yeah, Dr. Watts, real quick, I do think that a lot of military interventions by the U.S. are altruistic in nature. This one specifically.
Thank you. Well, we're done with the questions, and I think we can go ahead and close this session. Thank you, Mr. Benjamin Varlese, and thank you, Mr. Matthew Timmerman. These were some great presentations. Thank you for being with us here today, and hopefully we'll see you all in some of the next sessions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.